Well, hello, students in CRST 471A, 1 Corinthians. Today we had this pretty interesting discussion about chapter 12, the beginning of chapter 12. And I'm going to do a 7-minute summary the best I can, but I'm fearing that you're not going to understand this if you weren't in class today. So if you missed the class session, you might want to watch the whole thing. Amazon, set a timer for 7 minutes.
7 minutes, starting now.
So we start in chapter 12, verses 1, 2, and 3. And I'm just saying that the word spiritual at the beginning here is the word pneumatikoi. And you just need to know about that word. It can mean what a pagan, a person who comes from an idol worshiping background. This could be what they understand to be powers, prophecy, insight, dealing with spirits, and they would use the word pneumatikoi, that's the plural of it, to describe those kinds of abilities and gifts. So the Corinthians understood spiritual gifts that were in the church. It looks like they were using that kind of wisdom, because look in verse 2. Verse 1, he says, I do not want you to be unaware. You know that when you were pagans, you were led astray to the mute idols, however you were led. So here the problem in verse 2 is that they're looking at spiritual gifts based upon what they know from the religions they grew up in, idol worshiping religions. These are all converts. So they were pagans. They didn't understand God's grace and the way that God works. So now what Paul's going to do is give us a principle. And it took us about 40 minutes really to understand this principle. It's in verse 3. Now I make known to you that no one speaking by the Spirit of God, and I'll just notice here, literally it's in the Spirit of God, and I'll explain that later, says Jesus is accursed, and no one can say Jesus is Lord except by the Holy Spirit. Now first you're thinking what I always used to think, because when I came to faith in Jesus Christ at 20, I was charismatic for quite a long while. And I just believed I was talking about testing demons or the Holy Spirit. If the demon, if you say demons, say Jesus is Lord, well, they can't do it according to the theory. But actually, that's not true. They do it. I mean, even the demons call Jesus the Son of God. So I don't understand where people get that, except they misinterpret this. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that someone might say, well, this means that if you say Jesus is Lord, it means you have the Holy Spirit. Well, let's look at this again. And I'm going to give an explanation, but you really almost should watch the whole class session, because I think it comes clear in that. This is talking about a very simple understanding. What Paul is saying is, the person who has the Spirit of God is the person who says Jesus is Lord. You don't determine whether you have the Holy Spirit by whether you speak in tongues, even though lots of people say that. Lots of people say, oh, well, if you don't speak in tongues, you don't have the Holy Spirit. And that's not at all what Paul's saying. Paul's saying that if you have Jesus as Lord, you have the Holy Spirit. You're in the Holy Spirit. If Jesus is not your Lord, you're not. Jesus said, many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not cast out demons in your name and prophesy in your name, perform many miracles in your name? And Jesus said, go away from me, you workers of sin. I never knew you. Well, they prophesied in his name. They cast out demons in his name. They performed miracles in his name. They said to him, Lord, Lord. So just saying Jesus is Lord is not enough. And it's not the miracles, because they cast out demons. They performed miracles. They prophesied. So those things are not the things that tell you have the Holy Spirit. If Jesus is your Lord, you have the Holy Spirit. And that's what Paul's doing in verse 3. He wants us to understand that my relationship with God is not determined by the spiritual gift I have. My relationship with God is determined by the fact that Jesus is my Lord. And if Jesus is my Lord, I have the Holy Spirit. You may not be convinced by that, but you need to watch that whole lecture. Now, the varieties of gifts but the same Spirit, varieties of ministries and the same Lord, There are varieties of effects, the same God who works all things in all persons. This word gifts here is the other word for spiritual gifts, which is charismata for plural, or charisma for singular. And this is an important word because this word is built on the word grace, charis. And that's interesting. This word does not appear anywhere in any Greek literature you can read before the time of the church. Socrates and Plato, anybody that you read from the past, no one uses this word charisma. It's the church that invented the word. And the church invented the word to describe these special gifts that Christians have, charismata. And they used the word based on the word charis. We'll come back to that in another lecture. But I want you to notice here, the varieties of charismata, but the same spirit. But then look, verse 5, the varieties of ministries. And that's the word diakonia, where we get our word deacon from. There are varieties of ministries. Now, a ministry may not be prophecy. A ministry may not be speaking in tongues. A ministry may not be doing miracles. A ministry may be feeding the poor or teaching children or caring for the sick. See, a ministry can be sharing good news with people who don't understand. Ministries can be all sorts of things, and they may not be flashy or exciting or feel miraculous, but notice that Paul includes them as a part of this. And there are varieties of effects here in verse 6. That word energeia, we get our word energy from that. It's workings of God, where God does maybe miracles, but not necessarily always miracles. Not necessarily. What's Paul doing here? What Paul wants us to realize, we go back to verse 3, that the Spirit of God, having the Spirit of God, is not proven by the spiritual gift you have. Even though that's what people say today. They say, oh, if you speak in tongues, you have the Holy Spirit. Not necessarily. Someone brought that question up today. Well, what do you mean that a person can speak in tongues and not have the Holy Spirit? Well, according to verse 3, it's about the Lordship of Christ. So a person who speaks in tongues and goes out and gets drunk all the time, Paul says that no one who goes out and gets drunk all the time is entering the kingdom of heaven. No one who lives in sexual immorality is entering the kingdom of heaven. No one who is greedy is entering the kingdom of heaven. Good grief. Is that saying what it sounds like it's saying? Yes. That the evidence that you have the Holy Spirit is not the gift of tongues. The evidence is Jesus your Lord? That's the evidence in verse 3. And then we have varieties of charismata. We have varieties of ministries. We have varieties of effects. But there's one God, one Lord, one Spirit. Okay, so where we're going with this is we're just discovering this remarkable teaching about spiritual gifts, and we're finding, much to our shock, that what we see clearly written in these chapters is very different from what we see commonly practiced in the churches. Okay, well, our 7 minutes was up a minute ago, so I kind of broke the rule here. Sorry about that. God bless you all, and we'll see you on Wednesday.